Filipinos podcast.
Good day, everyone. We are about to witness a debate about Cavite Mutiny. Whose side is more reliable, the government or the opposition? Now, I would like to remind all debaters that facts should be reliable, convincing, and last is you should be trustworthy. And now, to introduce our debaters, the proposition or its first speaker, Ms. Chimera Cosio. The second speaker, Mr. Charles Cruz. And its third speaker, Ms. Rain Chua. And for the opposition are its first speaker, Ms. Rian Bermudo. And the second speaker, Ms. Eds Cañeda. And its third speaker, Mr. Mike Calvo. And I, Claire Cavan, am your host together with Ms. Nicole Cabrera.
Each speaker will deliver for a few minutes constructive speech. After each speech, I will immediately call upon the next speaker or debater to begin his or her address. Before anything else, I'll give an overview about Cavite Mutiny. The Cavite Mutiny broke out among the Filipino soldiers in the arsenal of Cavite under the leadership of Sergeant La Madrid. The unsuccessful mutiny was participated in by around 200 soldiers and laborers of the Engineering and Artillery Corps, who rose up after their salaries were reduced upon the order of Governor-General Rafael D. Izquierdo, by subjecting them to personal taxes from which they were previously exempt. They also identified other reasons that seemingly made the issue a lot more serious, which include the presence of the native clergy who, out of spite against the Spanish friars, conspired and supported the rebels. According to Izquierdo, native clergy attracted supporters by giving them charismatic assurance that their fight would not fail because they had God's support, aside from promises of lofty rewards such as employment, wealth, and ranks in the army. The friars used the incident as a part of a larger conspiracy to cement their dominance, which had started to show inconsistency because of the discontent of the Filipinos. They showcased the mutiny as part of a larger conspiracy in the Philippines by Filipinos to overthrow the Spanish government. Unintentionally and more so prophetically, the Cavite Mutiny of 1872 resulted in the martyrdom of Gomborza, whose active involvement in the campaign for secularization at that time paved the way to the revolution culminating in 1898. So now, let us start with the proposition or government addresses. First speaker for the proposition is Ms. Chimera Cosio.
Thank you for that introduction. Today, our motion believes that the Filipino version of Cavite Mutiny is more reliable. When discussing the Filipino version of the Cavite Mutiny, it is essential to take into account local sources and oral histories that provide insights from the Filipino perspective. These stories have been passed down through generations and provide a different perspective than the official Spanish colonial records, which may be biased or limited in their depiction of the events. We can acquire a better grasp of the motivations and experiences of the Filipino revolutionaries participating in the rebellion by emphasizing local sources and oral histories. For example, these narratives frequently emphasize the desire for independence, social justice, and resistance to Spanish persecution. Examining these narratives allows us to discover the genuine spirit that drove the Filipino people's activities throughout that time period. The Filipino version of the revolt attests to the event's validity and significance, providing a perspective that extends beyond colonial narratives of the time. The mutiny, which occurred in the Philippines during the Spanish colonial period, has been predominantly portrayed through the lens of colonial attitudes. Exploring the stories and eyewitness testimonials, on the other hand, yields a more authentic and significant picture of the revolt. There are numerous authentic Filipino narratives and eyewitness accounts that provide light on the insurrection. Writings by Filipino independence activists, mutiny participants, and oral traditions passed down through generations are among the sources. The Filipino stories add new insights and viewpoints to our knowledge of the insurrection. They provide a more detailed representation of the Filipino participants' motivations, aspirations, and hardships, which colonial histories often omit. For a complete understanding of the event, it is critical to consider these Filipino perspectives alongside colonial narratives. We acquire a more accurate and full picture of the revolt by considering these various points of view. Thus, investigating the Filipino interpretation of the revolt provides a more real and relevant understanding of the event. The Filipinos participants' recollections and testimony provide distinct views and viewpoints that challenge the colonial narrative's prejudices. The Filipino version captures the actual spirit of the rebellion by emphasizing the longing for freedom and opposition against injustice. We can obtain a better knowledge of historical events by embracing these many points of view. And that is all. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks. I now call upon the first speaker for the opposition, Ms. Rian Bermudo.
On the 20th of January 1872, Filipinos awakened their patriotism and nationalism that led to the Philippine Revolution against the abuses of Spanish colonial regime, called the event as Cavite Mutiny. Every story has different perspectives and each one has its own bias. One side can claim that events occur while the other side does not have, while the other points out contents that did not happen to another side. Since we are all Filipinos and we are in the Philippines, we are basically using the Filipino version and it's going to be believed and followed by more Filipinos. History books state that Philippine nationalism was born with this tragic event. The presumption is that before that date, people did not feel that they were one nation, and any indication of protest against Spanish and Spain's foreign presence was a regional act of rebellion that the rest of the world did not associate with. Objective-wise, the Group 1 and 5 believe that the Cavite Mutiny was just a conspiracy and our opposition stance. So here are my statements against the affirmative. First, in the stance of the affirmative, it was believed that the Cavite Mutiny was an uprising due to the fact that it was taught using the Philippine narrative, believing in one version made by the same nation without acknowledging another side, which is the Spanish version, proves bias. Second, it is worth noting that the Philippines' historical issue about the event is limited and it leads to the different fallacies such as hasty generalization and false dilemma. Third, the revolt in Cavite was not a mere mutiny, but a part of planned separatist revolution. That is why we believe that it is a conspiracy. And lastly, the accounts stemming from Antonio Regidor, although containing many factual names and events, are not reliable narratives of those revolt and its causes.
The second speaker for proposition, Mr. Charles Cruz.
Thank you, esteemed moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, the Cavite Mutiny of 1872 stands as a critical chapter in the Philippine history, one that undeniably left an incredible mark of the nation's culture and social fabric. The tragic event that unfolded, particularly the execution of the Gomborza priest, served as a catalyst for the awakening of Filipino nationalism and a renewed commitment to preserving and celebrating our cultural heritage. The Cavite Mutiny was a crucible that forged the spirit of Filipino nationalism and ignited the flames of independence. The harsh repercussions that followed, including the execution of the Gomborza priest, became a rally cry for Filipinos to unite against colonial oppressions. The mutiny was not merely an isolated event, but a catalyst that fueled subsequent independence movements, marking the beginnings of sustained struggles of sovereignty. Beyond political aspirations, the mutiny prompted a profound introspection into our identity. The tragic event became a catalyst for a redefinition of what it means to be a Filipino. It sparked a renewed appreciation for our cultural heritage, as Filipinos sought solace and strengthened in their shared history of resistance. The Filipino version, by its nature, encapsulated the rich tapestry of our indigenous language and traditions. It served as a linguistic bridge, enabling the transmission of traditional wisdom, folklore, and cultural nuance across generations. In embracing and incorporating regional language and expressions, the Filipino version acts as a guardian, preventing the erosion of our linguistic diversity. The Filipino version goes beyond being merely a means of communication. It serves as a cultural cornerstone, actively contributing to the formation of our national identity. Through the incorporation of diverse linguistic, influence, and cultural expressions, it forged a common language that mirrors both the diversity and unity of the Filipino populace. This shared linguistic identity becomes a catalyst for a profound sense of belonging, solidarity, crucial elements in the establishment of robust national identity.
Thank you. Now I call upon the second speaker for the opposition, Ms. Eds Cañeda.
Remember the importance of impartiality when assessing the reliability of historical narratives. Let me further strengthen our argument against the notion that the Filipino version of the Cavite Mutiny is more reliable by highlighting additional historical perspectives and sources. One of the most significant sources of information regarding the Cavite Mutiny is the account of a Cementerio y Vidal, a Spanish official in Manila during that period. It is worth noting that the account of a Cementerio y Vidal is the fullest account of the mutiny itself, and his perspective offers a crucial insight as an observer with access to official records and first-hand information, which may provide a more balanced and comprehensive view of the events in question. Relying solely on the Filipino version of the mutiny could potentially overlook critical details and biases with the historical interpretation. Furthermore, the narrative presented by Governor Izquierdo adds an additional layer of complexity to the understanding of Cavite Mutiny. Governor Izquierdo's account is based on the idea of a coordinated attempt by Cavite arsenal workers and native soldiers to foment a revolt. This perspective is not only based on official documents but also articulated in a 60-page letter addressed to the overseas minister. Such a detailed account, coming from a colonial authority, carries significant weight in understanding the context and motivations behind the mutiny. Ignoring this perspective would result in an incomplete historical analysis and a potential bias towards one particular viewpoint.
Let us now proceed to the third speaker for proposition, Ms. Rain Chua.
Thank you for the introduction, Ms. Cabrera. Today, we dig into the past, where municipal administration records serve as a collection for historical echoes. The key to comprehending the complex nature of the Cavite Mutiny lies in these records, which are sometimes overlooked by more notable literatures. Let's examine these underappreciated viewpoints and find the voices of those who experienced these turbulent times. A wealth of knowledge regarding the colonial perspective on the Cavite Mutiny can be found in Spanish colonial records kept in the Archive of the Indies in Seville, Spain. A report submitted by Captain General Narciso Claveria on February 22, 1873 is one noteworthy document. In this paper, Claveria recognized the rising discontent among Filipino troops serving in the Spanish army and clarified the socio-economic causes of the mutiny. But a deeper look reveals that these records have biases and omissions built right in. For instance, many colonial accounts tend to minimize the complaints of the Filipino soldiers in favor of highlighting their disobedience. Furthermore, the voices of local priests and community leaders who backed the insurrection were frequently absent from papers written by the Spanish clergy, which gave us a distorted perspective. An in-depth explanation of the event is provided through an investigation of municipal records from Cavite City. The Alcaldía Mayor de Cavite's records contain a collection of letters that local priests and community figures in Cavite exchanged. These preserved letters shed light on a side of the mutiny that is rarely mentioned in mainstream historical narratives. The letters were written by local clergymen who were divided between their loyalty to the Spanish government and their compassion for the misery of the mutineers. Others saw it as a desperate cry for justice in the face of exploitation and injustice. Some religious members condemned the mutiny as an act of rebellion against the monarchy. The correspondence also contains letters from local authorities expressing solidarity with the mutineers, which provide light on the internal conflicts of the clergy and demonstrate the complexity of allegiances under colonial administration. These leaders, who came from different facets of society, understood that the mutiny was an expression of the community's general complaints. Their assistance was not only symbolic, rather, it was a protest against repressive colonial practice. These letters show a sense of community among the people that transcends social strata.
The third speaker, Ms. Rain Chua for Proposition, will now deliver the last speech opposing the case.
We have found a rich tapestry of opinions by methodically researching a variety of sources, including local administrative documents and oral traditions, and bringing to light voices that had been long silenced. These stories create a vivid picture of a complicated historical event that goes beyond the limiting dichotomies frequently used in conventional descriptions. The Filipino version provides a complex view of the revolt because it is based on indigenous knowledge, oral histories, and undiscovered records. It resonates as a multifaceted battle that includes socio-economic difficulties, ethical issues, and collaboration between communities rather than just as a resistance against colonial rule. By recognizing and accepting these underappreciated viewpoints, we uphold the accuracy of Filipino narratives and promote a more inclusive, sympathetic, and truthful interpretation of the Cavite Mutiny and of our common past.
The third speaker for Proposition, Mr. Mike Calvo.
Good day, everyone! Before I will proceed on the main content of my speech, I will be giving the overview first so that for the whole duration of my speech, you will be guided. I will start with introducing again the motion, our side as opposition, rebuttals, then our proposition stating why people should favor our argument. Now, I will be reintroducing the motion. This House believes that the Filipino version of the Cavite Mutiny is much more reliable than the Spanish version of it, in which us, in the opposition, it is our job to prove why the Spanish perspective is much more authentic, attested, and valid to be used as reference than the Filipino one. Now for my rebuttals. It was mentioned by the government side that the Filipino version of the said evidence is much more reliable. It is because of local sources and oral histories, in which we have to take into account that the information spread orally are most of the time not reliable unless supported by facts, which will make it secondary source. Then it was also mentioned that just because one shows sympathetic feeling and from an underappreciated viewpoint, it is already considered an accurate source. So are the people from the government side implying that to have a reliable source, one should show the mentioned feelings? Now, for the opposition, we believe that the Spanish version of the Cavite Mutiny is generally considered to be more reliable than the Filipino version for a number of reasons. Number 1, it is based on primary sources. The Spanish version of the mutiny is based on the official government documents such as military reports and court transcripts, which means that it is based on first-hand accounts of the events. Number 2, it is corroborated by other sources. The Spanish version of the mutiny is also corroborated by the accounts of other witnesses, including both Spanish and Filipino individuals. Number 3, it is more consistent with the historical context. The Spanish version of the mutiny is much more consistent with the known historical context of the time. For example, it is known that there was a growing movement for Philippine independence in the early 1870s. This makes it more likely that the mutiny was an attempt to overthrow the Spanish government, as the Spanish version claims. Now to compare it to the Filipino version of the mutiny, it is based on secondary sources such as oral histories and the writings of the Filipino nationalists, in which the government argues that it is reliable because of these reasons. However, what they believe is more susceptible to errors and inaccuracies. Additionally, the Filipino version of the mutiny is often biased in favor of the Filipino people and against the Spanish colonial government.
Thank you for your remarks. The third opposition speaker will now deliver the last pitch opposing the case.
Now, for our proposition, it is important to note that there is no consensus among historians on the reliability of either the Spanish or Filipino versions of the Cavite Mutiny. Some believe that the Spanish version is more reliable because it is based on primary sources and is corroborated by other sources in which us in the opposition believes. Others believe that the Filipino version is more valuable because it provides a Filipino perspective on the events, but just because it has a Filipino perspective on it, it doesn't mean that it is already reliable. Ultimately, Madam Chair, it is up to each individual to decide which version of the Cavite Mutiny they find more credible. However, in the opposition side, given the evidence mentioned, it is clear that the Spanish version is generally considered to be more reliable, more valid than the Filipino one. Thank you.
That ends our debate. Each speaker or side has explained and justified their points very well. Thank you for your insightful contributions to our discussion. All your efforts in preparing and engaging in this activity are much appreciated. Now, for our listeners, we hope that you are enlightened by the issues and the impact of these matters in Philippine history. Thank you and good day.